Hello, welcome to the podcast of the Anti-Discrimination Centre Memorial. Today's episode is devoted to Indigenous rights. Our colleague, Yana Tannagasheva, a well-known activist and member of the Shor people, an indigenous group in southern Siberia. Yana currently represents the International Committee of Indigenous Peoples of Russia, a group of activists living in forced displacement. Yana is joining our conversation to tell us what risks to expect from the new wave of repressions against activists and defenders of indigenous rights in Russia. On July 25th, the Russian Justice Ministry effectively outlawed indigenous rights defenders. Their organizations were declared extremist and added to the corresponding list. This decision came right around International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, which was established by the UN and is celebrated on August 9th. Russia marked this day not by drawing attention to indigenous rights, but by criminalizing activists and human rights defenders.
Yana, the International Committee of Indigenous Peoples of Russia, and other indigenous organizations were added to the Justice Ministry's list of extremist organizations. What does this mean for you, and how will this egregious decision by the Russian authorities reflect on the overall situation of Russia's indigenous peoples?
It is essentially a threat to those in Russia, in the regions of Siberia, the Far East, and the North. For members of indigenous peoples, it amounts to the inability to speak about their rights. And for those organizations and representatives of those organizations currently working outside of Russia, in exile, I can say that this is yet another act of intimidation. And this is a demonstration by the Russian authorities of what they can do. They can put anyone they want on various lists, including indigenous people. But, primarily, as I already said, this means that we effectively cannot defend our rights. For indigenous people who are in Russia, this is extremely dangerous. This essentially means that any human rights activities by indigenous peoples in Russia will be viewed as extremist and could involve criminal prosecution. So these could be searches, various types of so-called talks, intimidation by the FSB. It will be extremely dangerous for indigenous people in Russia to speak about what is probably the main right reflected in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the right to self-determination. In today's Russia, the right of indigenous peoples to self-determination is equated with separatism. The Russian Federation currently views indigenous peoples as some sort of structural unit of a non-existent anti-Russia separatist movement. Indigenous peoples throughout the world fight for the right to self-determination by, for example, going to international platforms like the UN and speaking out loud about violations of their rights in their countries. This will be impossible for the indigenous peoples of the Russian Federation. It could be equated with separatism. For me personally, I'll probably say more about our organization, the International Committee of Indigenous Peoples of Russia. We are in exile outside of the country. I believe that our organization, which is also on this list, will continue even in this time of war and political repressions to work to defend indigenous rights and promote them at an international level. And we will try to influence the global agenda, which is also very hard to do. But we also need to support the community at the grassroots level. Things are extremely complex for them today, and it's very important to continue to inform not just the international community of indigenous peoples, but the international community as a whole, international platforms, and international human rights institutions about the reality of Russia's indigenous peoples. It will be very difficult for indigenous peoples in the regions to continue to defend their rights, primarily their rights to land, to their territories, and their right to continue engaging in their traditional occupations. We know today that big business, the mining companies, are destroying indigenous lands. It will be difficult to achieve consultations, to achieve justice, to say nothing of free, prior, and informed consent, when indigenous peoples must be asked about mineral extraction before big business arrives in their territories. It is already difficult and impossible to speak about this in our country. Reindeer herders, fishermen, foragers, that is, people who are engaged in traditional activities at the grassroots level are also in danger today. Any indigenous person could be called an extremist today if they talk about their rights. But this is completely absurd. It's surreal when indigenous peoples are declared extremists based on the opinion of Russian authorities. People who have lived their whole lives since the beginning of time in these areas, who have been the protectors of these areas, these lands.
Yana, in July, you took part in the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. Did you get a chance to speak there?
Yes,
Да, в этом году в
the
июле
UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was held in July. Indigenous peoples from all over the world go there to make statements about their rights and report violations to the UN and the international community. I was only able to speak once during the session, namely during an interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and the UN treaty body, the Human Rights Council. I was able to speak on behalf of female members of Indigenous peoples, the Buryat and Sakha, on behalf of 3 young women who, it appears, were not allowed to participate in the expert mechanism. That was also an egregious case. It was very strange. They submitted an application to participate in the expert mechanism and were initially approved. Then the same day, they got a message that this had been a technical error. All 3 received it at the same time. That was probably the first time something like that happened in the history of UN registration. We wrote to the Special Rapporteur on Russia about this. We appealed to the Expert Mechanism Secretariat, but we didn't receive any response. We believe Russia's influence on UN structures and mechanisms can be seen here. It was at the expert mechanism that I was able to speak on behalf of these 3 women and state that Russia is today trying to influence the UN mechanisms on indigenous peoples. Naturally, this is unacceptable. We are trying to communicate to the international community of indigenous peoples information about the negative influence, the Russian propaganda that the Russian authorities are trying to plant through the international community of indigenous peoples. Vladislav Tanagashev, my colleague and spouse, who is also a member of the Shor people, also spoke there. He spoke about the violation of the linguistic rights of indigenous peoples. The topic of languages is very painful. People don't speak about it much in Russia or outside of Russia. A kind of pretty picture is offered up about the lives of indigenous peoples. Everything is being developed. Everyone speaks their languages. Language textbooks are being published. But there's nothing like this in actuality. No pedagogical or educational processes are taking place in indigenous languages. This is, in fact, terrifying to realize, because indigenous languages are disappearing. In his statement, Vladislav Tanagashev gave examples on how Alayut, Oroch, and other languages are on the verge of extinction. Take our Shor language. Very few people speak it today. The Shor language department was closed in 2010, even though Andrei Ilyich Chudakov, our Shor scholar, put a great deal of effort into opening it. This is not the sole or unique example of a violation.
Yana, your committee recently published a report about the Russian Association of Indigenous People of the North, RAIPON. This organization has basically become a mouthpiece for Russian propaganda and a lobbyist for mining companies, instead of working to protect the rights of indigenous people and represent them. Tell us how speeches by pro-state representatives of indigenous people on international platforms, particularly the UN, influence the overall agenda at these state bodies.
к сожалению, к большому сожалению, к
Regrettably,
сожалению,
the Russian Federation is attempting to disseminate its propaganda through, let me put it this way, GONGOs that it controls, that is, indigenous organizations like the one RAIPON unfortunately is today. An organization like this is essentially a puppet of the Russian government, and it introduces the Russian agenda into the global indigenous movement. This has an extremely harmful and destructive impact on all indigenous peoples. They are effectively misleading the global indigenous movement, which is extremely worrying. I must say that Russian government representatives always talk about their alleged anti-colonial agenda at UN platforms. In other words, they position themselves as defenders of indigenous peoples, but their agenda is not, in fact, anti-colonial. It is the opposite, that is, colonial. Today, Russia remains a prison of indigenous peoples and, at the same time, an active, aggressive colonizer. The Russian government is using indigenous peoples, is using RAIPON to achieve its goals, which are to secure territories, extract mineral resources, and continue influencing the international community and enriching itself at the expense of Indigenous peoples. Like marionettes, these subordinate organizations are always attached to strings. And today, they are attached to the government strings. I say this a lot, and I'll repeat it now. Indigenous peoples who are ingratiating themselves with the government today will never be friends with this government. That is, the Russian Federation will never consider Indigenous peoples its friends. And this will have a disastrous effect on Indigenous peoples in the future. When these violations intensify, when these representatives of Indigenous peoples will see violations and start to claim their rights. After all, repressions will evolve, repressions will intensify, so much so that the entire Indigenous movement could be deemed extremist. And if they're friends with the Russian government today, they will be its enemies tomorrow. The Russian government will never, I repeat, never be a friend of Indigenous peoples. And, as we see, it is proving this over and over again with its actions. Naturally, it is also showing the entire world that it is an aggressor, not just in relation to other peoples, but in relation to, quote unquote, its own, to the peoples of Siberia, the Far East, and the North.
Thank you, Yana.
And thank you, dear listeners, for listening to the podcast in its entirety. If you are interested in Indigenous rights, in international documents, and in Russian legal acts, then I will direct you to the website adcmemorial.org, which features a special section on Indigenous rights where you can read our reports, statements, and analytical materials about the development of international law in the sphere of Indigenous rights. Thank you for listening to our podcasts. I invite you to listen to our other episodes, both past ones and ones that will soon be released.